Hello, this is Eric from Bay Area Hang Gliding, reading another ground school article. This is The Wind Gradient by John Lake. 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 Okay. The Wind Gradient by John Lake. Let me try that. Sorry about that. I guess someone's here listening. This was published in Ground Skimmer magazine, 1977. Oh, no, October 1976. Wow, I should have printed this out bigger. The effects of wind gradient probably injure more hang glider pilots than stalls, yet they are rarely mentioned except by Paul McCready and Terry Sweeney. Wind gradients and their effects are fairly simple to understand. This article is a brief introduction and will provide a few suggestions for techniques that can help avoid wind gradient-induced problems in flight. Any sailor will tell you that boats with taller masts hold an advantage over boats with relatively shorter masts. The reason is that they can carry their sails higher where the winds blow stronger. Winds blow stronger where the tall masts reach because the winds are not slowed as much by friction with Earth's surface. A wind gradient is the speed differential along a line across the wind, in this case, a vertical line. See Figure 1. When pilots speak of the wind gradient, they are talking about a gradient near the Earth's surface caused by friction. If there is any wind, the wind gradient will be present. The more quickly the wind increases with altitude, the stronger is considered the gradient. Picture a training site. Ideally, it will have about 10-mile-an-hour breeze with smooth, stable air. It may be surprising, but stable air tends to have a stronger gradient than unstable air. Nice, stable marine air coming onto a beach will invariably have a relatively strong gradient. The reason for this is that unlike unstable air, which rolls around and around, exchanging momentum within itself, stable air slides over itself and, near the surface, is left alone by the stronger winds aloft. A student hang glider pilot first encounters the effects of the wind gradient during overly aggressive flares for landings. In first flights at good training sites, the student remains near the ground during the glide. Then in a strong flare, he sticks the nose of the glider up even farther, sometimes enough so that the glider slides backward to the ground, perhaps damaging the keel. For this reason, it might be wise for instructors to advise the students to try to run out a few steps on landing. Once a student is making flights with altitudes of 30 to 40 feet, he will encounter the best known effects of the gradient. See Figure 2. As the glider descends down through the gradient, airspeed will tend to diminish. In order to maintain airspeed, a pitch-stable glider will want to descend more rapidly. The student will counter by easing the nose up, causing the airspeed to drop off. This won't be readily apparent to the student because his ground speed will remain the same or increase. The result is often a hard mushing landing or even a stall and even a bent control bar. The answer is, of course, to carry extra airspeed on final approach. But the question is, how much extra airspeed? In a nice, smooth, and large landing area, it is difficult to come in with too much, but not all areas allow such liberties. Other things being equal, more airspeed would be advised in more stable air, but other things are not equal. In bumpy, unstable air, a little extra airspeed is advisable for control and to make passage through rolling air quicker. A rule of thumb often heard is to add half of the wind speed to your airspeed, or half to best glide. The point to remember is that smooth air shouldn't lull you into trouble. Stable winds have the stronger gradient. So far we have considered the effects of the gradient in straight and level flight, or in a flare straight into the wind, Things get a little more complicated when we introduce the factor of turns in a gradient. Furthermore, in this case, lack of understanding of the effects of the gradient can be more serious and can lead to accidents, quite capable of injuring the pilots. Indeed, it is here that we enter into situations that really have hurt a lot of pilots in hang gliding and continue to injure many because some instructors fail to properly explain the situation. It almost goes without saying that those who try to learn by themselves without the benefit of proper instruction will almost certainly encounter some hard knocks from mysterious crashes they attribute to tip stalls. In any turn, a glider must be in a banked attitude. One wing must be higher than the other end and will be in stronger wind than the wing which is closer to the ground. Furthermore, it should be evident that the high wing will be blown downwind relative to the low wing. See Figure 3. This fact should be engraved into the mind of anyone who cares to be a pilot. It is one of the basic and absolutely essential concepts. Let's consider a few consequences of this fact. Suppose you are flying crosswind as part of your landing approach. Your intention is to turn into the wind and land when you get down to an altitude of 15 to 20 feet. When you attempt to bank the turn, the glider will tend to resist the banking, and unless you have anticipated, the turn will overshoot the line you intended to follow to your landing. That's not too great a problem unless there happens to be a tree or power line in the way. Secondarily, as you go around in the turn, you must start off applying a great deal of control effort, but as you turn into the wind, this effort can put you into too steep a bank and could perhaps turn you into a crosswind or cross-downwind heading. The reason for the over-control is that the gradient does not affect your banking capability when heading into the wind. It is just the crosswind portion of turns where the gradient affects the banking. Now imagine a turn away from the direction which is into the wind. This is frequently seen in spot landing contests. A glider approaches to one side of the spot and the pilot starts a turn which will give him a crosswind track to the spot. Often the glider flicks around in a steep downwind turn and ends up in either a downwind landing or a crash. What happens is the high wing tends to blow over the low wing, causing a steep turn. This blowing over of the high wing can be very stronger than is controllable when coming as a surprise. It is hard to overemphasize the rapidity and power of this effect. The best advice is to never turn out of the wind near the ground unless really necessary, and keep in mind that the glider will want to turn very quickly and sharply. These last 4 paragraphs indicate that when flying in the wind gradient, a glider will want to turn downwind and stay flying downwind when entering a 360-degree turn direction into the wind. The glider will snap straight into a nice right turn until pointing downwind. At that point, however, it will start to want to roll out of the turn and stay flying almost downwind, and the pilot will have to apply much more control application to maintain a constant turning rate. The slow turning part of the 360 being during the part closest to the hill, and when you suddenly are filled with the desire to get around the turn. A very few years ago, a large aviation magazine carried an article by 2 pilots, one a crop duster and the other an airline pilot. The article was over the argument, old as aviation, about downwind turns. The crop duster argued that the downwind turn was dangerous because you tended to lose airspeed, whereas the airline pilot argued correctly that there is no difference in a turn due to the wind. The crop duster was basing his argument on experience. He just knew that the downwind turn was bad news. Unfortunately, he laid the source of this very real experience at the doorstep of the wind. The fact is that his experience was at very low altitudes, where he was in the gradient. It was the gradient, not the wind itself, that was causing him to think the downwind turns are different. They are different if you are in the gradient, but not if you are above the gradient. As pointed out, a turn is affected by the gradient because the high wing is in stronger wind and is blown downwind more strongly. This is the same as saying that the wing which is further from the ground is blown more strongly downwind. The fact is that you can be in a straight and level flight, yet your wings can still be across the wind gradient, just as if you were banked in a turn. This situation exists when flying or soaring near to or along a ridge or slope and the ground is banked instead of the glider. See Figure 4. All pilots who have soared along a ridge have noticed that they have to apply a banking force away from the nearby ridge. This tends to be a steady state thing and hasn't caused too much trouble except in gusts. When a gust hits, the effects of the gradient up the slope will intensify and act to roll the glider into the hill. Pilots have died because of this. They scratch along the edge of a steep ridge and a gust hits them, blowing them toward the lip. As they try to turn away into the wind, the gradient is lifting their windward wing, making the turn slow or impossible, or even causing them to turn toward the cliff. A more common accident with neophyte ridge or slope soaring pilots occurs when they turn. Sometimes this turn is when they first turn away from into the wind to fly along the ridge. They don't realize how tough it is going to be to stop the turn, so they allow the turn to go too far and they hook a wingtip. Just as often, an accident occurs when the pilot turns to go back down the slope in the other direction. When he starts the turn, he is turning into the wind, and he needs aggressive control application. However, as soon as he is turned across the wind, the glider will want to turn and can catch him by surprise. He turns too far and again ends up by hooking a wingtip and cartwheeling into the ground. This can be very pronounced as both the glider and the ground are banked. There can be no clear-cut rule for handling the gradient in turns and along slopes. My own suggestion is to initiate a roll out of the turn as soon as the glider is pointed into the wind. If you end up recovering from the turn too soon, it is easily dealt with, but if you allow a turn in these conditions to go too far, the result can be serious. Be wary of any downwind turn if you suspect a gradient may exist, and if you must turn, just sort of nibble at it so that the turn doesn't get too out of hand. Above all, think the whole concept of the gradient over and over in your mind so that you will reduce the chances of being caught by surprise. When hang rating tasks were designed, figure 8 patterns were included. One thing about them is that they tend to introduce wind gradient factors. In addition, they teach about other factors. In the near future, there will be an article considering figure 8 maneuvers, their whys and hows. Once again, here's the diagrams. All right, thanks everyone. That's about it. Bye.